1, 2, 3, we're hot. Here we go, everybody. Welcome to the Cowboy Perspective. I got a couple of super valuable mentors of mine in the room. And, Fain smiled a little bit when I said that. And the truth is, I haven't known Fain super well in my life. I mean, we just recently got to know him better and better through Lee and David and my continued growth in understanding of the importance of the history of Comanche, Texas, really the history of our country, the history of the world, all of these things. Fain happens to be one of the leading experts in our community, and we got a great opportunity to let him just build the chronological history of Comanche. So I'm going to let Fain do that. David will chime in when he gets a chance. If I hear something, I'm like, wow, I really want to learn some more about that. Well, I'll jump in. I might ask Fain to dig a little deeper on something. Without further ado, Fain, tell us where did Comanche come from? How did it start? Who started it? I know kind of like the Indians were here at one time, or I think we were named after the Comanche Indians, but I don't know much more than that. So what do you think? How did we get here?
To begin with, the Native Americans were the first known inhabitants of Comanche County, or what is now Comanche County. They were here about 10 to 14,000 years ago. They were in what they call the Paleo period. They were the Clovis and Folsom peoples. And there's a few of their artifacts have been found in Comanche County. And Texas state archaeologist Robert Maloof came first to identify and document these artifacts. Also, Dr. Rick Howard, that's connected with the Gore Research Center and the Texas Archaeological Research Laboratory at the University of Texas at Austin, and also Dr. Stephen Black, another well-known archaeologist in Texas. They've all been here to document these items. So we know that there were people here back in times, probably when there were woolly mammoths still walking around, and these people hunted with spears.
You ever heard of an atlatl?
Yes.
Did they use that?
They didn't use it that we know of. I think the atlatl came along probably during the Archaic period, because most of our Native American artifacts or arrowheads that are found are from the Archaic period, which was probably from about 5,000 years ago to 8,000 years ago. And then the next period of inhabitation, well, they used atlatls. The prehistoric period came after the Archaic, and that's kind of the era when they started using bow and arrows. And the little bird points you find out in peanut fields and things are what they used first with arrows. And then
hold on just a second. I want to move your mic just a bit.
Okay.
There we go. All right. So the bird points that we'll find in the fields went with those bows. Now, time out real quick for anybody listening, or if you're just now catching on to this, we got a museum in town, and I really want this conversation to spur you some interest in that. Go check out the Comanche County Museum. Support them by attending or financially in their fundraisers, those kind of things. I think the museum is one way we keep extending this understanding of where we come from and our history. Do you have anything from these eras you're talking about in the museum?
Yes, we have a rather large collection of Native American artifacts that mostly have been found in Comanche County, and they deal with all those time periods. There was when the historic period came along, that's when the first Europeans came over, the Spanish and the French. They brought metal arrowheads with them to trade to the Indians, and the Indians began making their own metal arrow points. The Comanches primarily used metal arrowheads. They didn't really do flint knapping much. They would use what they would find that had been left behind by other tribes, or they would, when they were on a raid, they would scour the places that they raided, and like a wooden barrel had iron bands around it, they would strip all that iron bands off of there, and they would shape their metal arrowheads out on that. So,
all right. So, where are we in the timeline of Comanche? So we started, pretty long time ago, which I don't understand well. I get a little glossy eyed when you start talking about 5,000, 50,000 years ago. But now we're up to arrowheads and metal, and I've studied the Comanches a little bit and interested in Indians and Native Americans.
The Comanches are of Shoshonean stock. They came from up in the area of Wyoming, and they were chased out by other more fierce tribes, and they started moving their way south. But as the Spanish came over to North America, they brought horses with them, and the horses multiplied over the decades, and the Comanches got a hold of these horses and learned how to ride them, and they became the finest light horsemen that the world has ever known.
I mean, I've read, I've heard, I listened to some stories about just there wasn't much anything more feared than a Comanche horseback.
A Comanche riding horseback in battle could slide over on the side of his horse. He had a rawhide thong that he put one elbow in, and he would be looking underneath the horse's head. At full gallop, he could fire off a whole quiver of arrows before a settler could reload his muzzle-loading rifle one time.
Yeah.
They used short bows made out of usually bowdark or something like that, some hard, but they were short bows, and they were very effective horseback or on foot.
And those people roamed this part of the world.
They did. They took over.
So why would we ever come out here? I kind of think, who is the craziest person to come try to settle this part of the country?
Well, there were several bands of Comanches. They ranged all the way from Kansas down to Mexico, and the southernmost band of the Comanches were the ones that were here. They were called the Penatukas, Penatuhkah. That was that particular band that was here, and they were the first to encounter the Spaniards, the first to encounter the Mexicans when Mexico won its independence, and then they were the first to encounter the Texans. They bore the brunt of most of the battles, and of course, it's the settlements after the Texas Revolution. Texas won its independence. The settlements started moving north and westward, and it really caused problems with the Comanches because they fiercely defended their homeland and their territory.
Yeah.
And
I mean, I just think about those days, and I got to give a big, appreciation for those pioneers, those people brave enough to go, those who had enough sand to get out on the frontier where there's no help, nobody to tell them how or what to do, and just stick with it.
They were a tough breed of people. They had to be.
Yep. All right. So that seems like my next question, or kind of, I'm also butting in here, so don't let me get you off your timeline. What's the next piece of the timeline? Matter of fact, I'm just going to let you keep going.
Okay, we're up to the historic period. That's when the first Europeans, which were the Spaniards and the French, came into this territory. Spaniards the conquistadors, they call them, were always exploring new land and looking for gold and silver and precious metals to mine and send back to Spain. And they found enough silver ore in the hill country and in this area to do their mining. But the first that we know of are incursion into this part of the country by the Spanish was a man named Moscoso, who was a lieutenant of De Soto, which was a Spanish explorer. And he made his way across Texas from the Mississippi River to meet up with Coronado, who was coming up from Mexico through West Texas. They were trying to link up, and that was in 1541. And it's thought that Moscoso came across Comanche County, made his way to the Colorado River, on out through the area south of Abilene around Buffalo Gap, and then made a swing back. Couldn't find Coronado, who was several hundred miles away, and made his way back to the Mississippi, and without finding. But there is a Spanish mission. The Spanish soldiers carried priests along with them, Franciscan or other denominations of Catholic priests, and they were wanting to Christianize the Indians. And there is the ruins of a Spanish mission still standing just over the line in Erath County, on the Comanche-Erath County line. And some mortar was sent off from that stone building and carbon dated in the 1500s. So Spanish shows they were actually here in the 1500s. The reason we know it's a Spanish mission is the early settlers came in to this area and saw Indians going in this building, and they would stay in there about an hour, and then they would come out. And finally, the settler found an Indian that could speak some English, and he asked him, "What are you doing in there?" And he said, "We're praying." So they'd been Christianized their generations before, and they were still using that building as a house of worship long after the Spanish had gone. So,
wow, that's crazy. Those are cool stories.
And the Spanish next known entry into Comanche, what is now Comanche County, by the Spanish soldiers was in 1719, when an Indian of the Payayas Nation, P-A-Y-A-Y-A-S, came into San Antonio with a large chunk of silver ore, and the Spanish governor had it assayed and found that there was enough silver and copper in the ore to be worthy of mining. So he sent a squad of soldiers back with the Indian to his homeland, and they followed the upper reaches of the Leon River, went through present-day Sydney, up Jimmy's Creek, and found to the head of Little Jimmy's Creek, southwest of Sydney. They found the Indians were working a mine and mining silver and copper and making trinkets and bells and things out of that. But the Spanish immediately took over the mining operations, and throughout the 1700s, up until at least 1762, they were here mining silver. There is silver here.
Wow. That makes me, I guess it's not a lot though, because I couldn't point at where a mine is today.
There are actually several mining sites around the northern part of Comanche County.
Active?
No, not active.
Oh, gotcha.
But they've all been, of course, the Comanches probably chased out the Spaniards, and they covered up their mines, or if they didn't have time to cover up the mines, the Indians would cover them, because they knew that the silver ore meant that those people were coming back sometime to do more mining, so they would cover them up and hide them themselves. And they were carvings on rocks in Comanche County. One's at the Comanche County Museum of One's a tombstone, date May 17th, 1741. And then further up the Savannah River, a few miles, there's another rock that was dated 1731. So there's other evidence of Spanish mining in the county. And there was the lieutenant Spanish governor of Texas named Bernardo Miranda was instructed by the Spanish governor of Texas to go north of San Antonio and search for silver. And he came in the Comanche County area about 1756. And the Viceroy of Spain visited their county in 1756. I've seen a carving on the rock of his name. He was known as the Marquis of Amaryllis. The Spanish mission, or Spanish Presidio Menard, was named after him in his honor. And he was up here supervising Spanish mining operations in 1756. I've seen his name carved on rocks on the side of the
How in the world were
bluff.
they carving into rock? Well,
They had
took a long time to do it.
Took a long time to do it. They had special chisels made out of brass, but they had brass tips on them, and they could carve pretty well into the limestone rock. But they would leave treasure markings and things for if they had to leave a place. They would, if they came back later on, or someone else came back looking for the mine, they could go by those markings and know how to find that mine.
All right. So what's that? We're up to about middle of 1700s.
We jump from there to about 1820. There was an Anglo trader. He traded with Indians. His name was Anthony Glass, and he was in this area and described the area and the inhabitants, and described actually seeing the Indians carried him to a small pointy-shaped hill that was overgrown with brush, and he got up close to it. He recognized that it was a pyramid, and nobody has found that since. He wrote about that, but I assume it's one of these little small knobby hills around that nobody's paid any attention to.
Yeah.
And then the first really well-known Anglo person to come across Comanche County was Bigfoot Wallace, the famous Texas Ranger, in 1837. He wrote about it in his memoirs, and he came into the county around the South Leon River and followed the Leon on up into in the Palapena Mountains in what is now Palapena County, and got captured by the Comanches for a while, and finally made his escape and came back through and on his way back to civilization. And in 1849, after Texas became a state, the United States government appointed an Indian agent named Robert Simpson Neighbors to oversee all the well-being of the Indians in Texas and try to keep peace with them through peaceable efforts. And he met up at Torrey's Trading Post near Waco with Comanche War Chief Buffalo Hump, who was from this area, and Comanche Civil Chief Old Owl, who had a camp on Armstrong Creek northeast of De Leon. And they came back to Old Owl's camp along with Neighbors and his party, where it would be another well-known Texas Ranger named John Selman Rip Ford. And they came across from Old Owl's camp, went straight southwest across the county, passing what is the town of Comanche, through Mercer's Gap, and went to where the Regency Bridge area is now in Mills County, to the camp of Chief Sanako, another Comanche chief. And Neighbors was well known to and well despised by the Anglo settlers because he was helping the Indians, and they didn't. There was so much hatred between the Texans and the Comanches that there was a lot of animosity toward some neighbors, and he finally was assassinated for helping the Indians move into Oklahoma out of Texas before anybody else found out about it. And when he came back to Fort Belknap, he was assassinated by a settler that was mad about that. So
crazy stories, crazy times.
Yeah.
Awesome. All right, keep going. This is all good.
Okay, from 1849, after the Mexican War, or the war with Mexico was over with, about 1848, the U.S. Army built the first line of forts from the Rio Grande all the way to Fort Worth. And the one closest to us was at Gatesville, Fort Gates, built in 1850, about 1850. Actually, a later Comanche County resident helped build that fort, and his name was T.J. Neighbors, and who lived here in Comanche. And anyway, the Army settlements were moving westward at a faster pace, so the Army needed to get out further amongst the Indians, so they built a second line of forts out in West Texas, from Fort McCavitt near Menard to Fort Chadmore near Bront, Fort Phantom Hill near Abilene, Fort Belknap up near Graham in Young County. And there they made a mistake because they sent infantry out into West Texas to fight Indians that mounted on horseback, and they soon discovered that they needed dragoons to help chase the Indians and fight them. And there was a need. The Army couldn't move supplies fast enough with their own wagons from the second line of force to the first to resupply, so the Army started hiring civilian contractors down around Gatesville to haul ox trains of supplies to these outlying forts. If you watch the movie Dances with Wolves, you saw a big freight wagon in that movie. And that's what those wagons look like. There would be one wagon pulling another wagon behind it, and there would be 10 yoke of oxen pulling that. That was called a span. And there were 10 spans in a wagon train. So that means there were 200 oxen and men walking along beside them with long bull whips, urging them forward, and one man riding the wagon, and maybe another man or two, a few men walking around along, watching for Indians at the same time. Several times the Indians in this area would set fire to the prairies trying to burn off the wagon trains, which they almost did a time or two.
Yeah.
And some of our first sheriff, Thomas J. Holmesley, and later settler F.M. Cross, and another later settler here in Comanche, Elias L. Deaton, they all freighted on those, worked on those freight lines to these outlying forts. And the old road from Fort Phantom Hill, Fort Gates to Fort Phantom Hill passed through Comanche. There were a couple of legs of that road. The first one came into the county near Newburgh and made its way west through near Logan's Gap, through Sweetwater Gap towards Sydney, and on out toward what is presently Rising Star. And then a year or two later, they moved the route of the road over to a little more northerly, an easier to traverse area, which was the divide between Mercer Creek and Holmesley Creek, which they crossed down on the South Leon River, and that's where Cora would be established in 1854. And that's why Cora was established there, because it was on the military road. and it was the only really real road in the country in those days, and that's why Cora got its start. Comanche, the residents of Comanche County got populated enough to want to be petitioned to become a county, so they sent Frank Collier to Austin to meet with the legislature about organizing a county. So the 6th legislature appointed Dr. Ransom Tuggle, Jesse Mercer, and C.C. Campbell of Comanche County to be the ones who got organized the county. And it fell to a member of the legislature each time a new county was formed to give the new county a name. So it fell to a man named Colonel John Henry Brown, and he admired the Comanches, which earned him a lot of disdain from most Texans, but he named the county Comanche, and that's where it got its name from. And then
man. That's pretty. I wouldn't have guessed that. I would have guessed it'd have been more elaborate, something like, here's a bunch of different names we like, let's vote over them.
The first county seat, of course, was at Cora, but when they applied, the citizens applied, the township applied for a post office or a name, they sent in the name Troy, and the postal department in Washington sent it back, said there's already a Troy in Texas, try another name. So Thomas C. Frost, who was a lawyer and was helping to organize the county here in Comanche County, he sent in a list of names, and among those names was a childhood or a friend of his, a lady friend of his named Cora Beeman from Belve County, where he was from, and the postal department picked Cora as a name, and that's where it got its name, Cora, from Cora Beeman.
Now, clear me up here. I don't have any clue, actually. We've got Old Cora, which is that old, I guess, courthouse, or...
Yes, that's the first county courthouse.
Where did that sit? Or it is... Are you going to get here and I'm just jumping in too early? Did Cora become Comanche, or is Cora still around?
There's nothing left of the original town of Cora except the cemetery. There's now a state historical marker at the Cora Cemetery. But it's off the Farm Market Road there, where the South Leon crosses the road from Newburgh to Energy. Where the South Leon crosses it, the courthouse, the town site was just a little back this way, north of the highway.
Where's that in relation to Pettit?
It'd be east of Pettit.
East of Pettit,
2 or 3 miles.
All right.
And the original courthouse was just a one room, and they moved it later to the top of a hill there as you come up out of the dip across the South Leon River, and they added an extra room for it on there. And from there it went, years later it was moved to Lake Eanes. And then A.P. Burks, a local historian, opened a museum in Comanche in the 1960s and moved the courthouse from Lake Eanes to his place up here on North Austin in Comanche. And then from there, it came to the courthouse square in Comanche. So it's been about 5 different moves.
Yeah. I mean, that'll tell you they built something right back in those days, just the idea that it stayed together. I mean, were they taking it all apart and then putting it back? Is that how they moved it?
Well, they moved it from A.P. Burks' place in Comanche to the courthouse square. It was on a moving truck. It was all together.
Yeah.
But otherwise, I think the logs were dismantled, and in the early days they didn't have the moving equipment we have now. So
yeah,
still quite a feat if you think about it.
Oh, yeah,
and that it survived.
Almost every. See, I guess I don't have any other perspective. I've got no other way to think about it. But all the stories you're telling just make me think, that was hard. All of that just seems to be really hard. These huge wagon trains, 10 oxen, like people just knew how to make it happen. Like I wouldn't know how to do that. If I looked up and had to drive a team of oxen with a wagon to get something done, I'd be in trouble.
They actually shoed the oxen like horses. They had something called an ox shoe. Of course, they had cloven hooves, but the terrain was difficult in places, so they learned they had to shoe the oxen. And at night, they would circle the wagons just like they did that you've seen in the movies about the wagon trains out on the frontier would circle the wagons at night for protection. That's what they did with those wagons also. But I can imagine having to unhitch or unyoke
that many oxen, that many different teams of them. That's a pretty interesting. I'll bet you it was like clockwork. I bet there were people that didn't know this was my piece of the job, and it just flowed. But as a guy who's never done it, it seems like a big task.
It's amazing what they did and what they accomplished. Going back to the military roads, which were established in about 1850 across the county. Captain Randolph Marcy, a U.S. Army captain, and was in charge of finding wagon routes across Texas and places to build forts. So he was in charge of laying out the Fort Gates, Fort Phantom Hill road that passes through Comanche. He had with him 6 Delaware Indian scouts or guides, and Marcy would be in the middle. And they started from around where Fort Phantom Hill is now, and went all the way to Fort Gates with Marcy in the middle, and three men spaced a mile apart to his left, and same way to the right. And they covered about 6 miles, and they would find the best terrain to put a road on, or the best crossings on the creeks and rivers that way. And they would mark these things, and then the Army topographical engineers would come back and cut down the creek banks and lay out the roads for the traffic. And it was on those roads, there was that the first encounter between the Comanches and the Army happened on South Coppers Creek in 1853. At a nooning on the creek, the soldiers looked up and one exclaimed, "Have all these post oaks turned into Comanches?" And there were about 100 Comanche warriors surrounded them, and the chief, they interviewed the chief, and they asked him what he wanted. He said, "I want horses and wagons." And they said, "I'm going to take them." And he said, "If you don't think this 100 warriors is enough, there's 100 more just over the hill." So they emptied out the wagons and set the soldiers afoot. There wasn't any casualties, but the Indian boys amused themselves by shooting at the U.S. on the wagons with their bows and arrows. And that was recorded by the soldiers that finally made their way to Fort Croghan down at Burnett about a month later. Nearly starved to death along the way, but they got there. But that was the first known encounter between the Army and the Indians in Comanche County. Now, there was another road across Comanche County when the California gold rush began in the late 1840s, about 1848. There was a lower immigrant trail. There was a mass rush of people from the eastern states to California, and some of them came across Texas, and one of those roads passed from Shreveport, Louisiana to El Paso, and one of them came across the northern part of Comanche County, passed near De Leon, what is now De Leon, and Duster and Seep Springs. There's southwest of Duster, there are cuts in the limestone rocks of the wagon ruts of how much traffic there were. And there was an Indian fight off of that road in 1854 up near Indian Mountain. And there really wasn't a lot of Indian fights or troubles with the Comanches until 1857. started making lots of raids in Comanche County, and they started killing settlers, and there was an all-out war on the frontier, and it so much so that Texas Ranger John Salmon Rip Ford was in charge of 100-man detachment of Rangers, and he came to Comanche County, which he had already been through in 1849, and established and built a stockaded fort called Camp Leon near the junction of the South Leon River and Mercer Creek near Newburgh. And from there, they used that as their jumping off place for Indian operations all out up into Oklahoma, even the Texas Rangers. Of course, the warfare before 1835 was in the favor of the Comanches because they could outshoot, or they could kill a man if he fired his single shot. That time he got his muzzle-loading rifle reloaded or pistol, the Indians could be upon him and kill him before he could reload. But Colonel Samuel Colt, about 1835, invented something called the Patterson 5-shot revolver, and the Texas Rangers got a hold of that. And then the warfare with the Comanches turned in the favor of the Texans.
So the momentum went a different way.
A different way. That kind of gives you an idea of why the changes.
Yep, sure. Okay, so we've got Cora. Cora's been established. We've got a mailing address there. Somebody said this is. So when does Comanche, this town, happen?
Okay. And later in Comanche County was, of course, organized in 1856. And later in 1856, Hamilton County was organized. So they took off a large chunk of Comanche County and helped form Hamilton County, which left the county seat way down southeast of where the Comanche is now. And in those days, there was a law, Texas law, that all counties must have a county seat near the geographical center of the county. So there was a need then to move it more
central,
which Thomas C. Frost was the lawyer down at and helped organize Corey. Came to Comanche and helped lay out the town lots in 1858. And by 59, it became the county seat, and they gave it the name Comanche to go along with the county. Thomas C. Frost was a famous Texan himself, but after he left, he lived in Comanche during the Civil War. He served at several of the outposts in West Texas. But after the war, he went. In Reconstruction times, he could not use his law degree to make a living, so he went to San Antonio and opened up a feed company and started making money. And then he opened his own bank, which is the Frost National Banks of Texas, and they're still going strong today. And he's buried in Comanche in San Antonio, but he's certainly one of the people who have really helped put Comanche together, yeah.
Yeah. Wow. How about that, folks? Frost Bank. I think I can find one of those branches pretty close. Yeah, that's a cool story. Okay, so now we've got Comanche here. What are some of the first buildings that pop up? I think you're one of the few people that could probably walk around town right now and say, this was, that burned down in what year, and now that used to be this. So let's talk about some of that for a second. Okay. And I'm going to move David's mic a little because he might need to chime in here. Is that a good place to go, or is there some more of the timeline that we're going to miss?
That's a good. The town started building around the Courthouse Square, which was also laid out by Thomas C. Frost, and they mostly were wooden buildings. they did build a courthouse, which today is between the Texas Bank and the old Comanche National Bank building where Starbo's restaurant is. And it's kind of set right in the middle of the Houston Street there. And it was a picket style courthouse, log courthouse. The logs are standing vertically. But it burned in 1862. Fortunately, one of the county workers had taken some of the county books home to work on them at night, and that saved part of the county's records. The rest of them got burned up in the fire. And of course, that left the county without a courthouse for several more years. What the county did was they would rent buildings around the square for the use of a courthouse.
Okay.
And they were using, by the time the 1870s rolled around, they were using the rock building where the Comanche Abstract Company used to be, or maybe still is. They
kind of there on the east side of the square.
It was a 2-story rock building. Dave Carnes had a restaurant in the bottom of it, bottom level, and the courthouse and jail were on the top level. And there was had been talk of building another courthouse, and there was just this big pile of rocks out in the middle of the courthouse square waiting for the day that they would build one. But 1868, the north side of the square burned, and there were fires over the decades after that, destroyed the west side of the square and the south side. And fires burned all the way around the square.
Yeah, but I'm about to probably say something pretty stupid. Why so many fires?
They in those days they used kerosene lamps. Probably a lamp would get knocked over for some reason.
That's what I was thinking. There wasn't even electricity yet.
No, a long ways from that. And it was only the first fire in 1868 that burnt the north side of the square. There was only a bucket brigade for the Comanche. What was the Comanche Fire Department in those days, and the well was there by the Fleming Oak. So by the time they got the water to the north side of the square, there wasn't enough. Everything had already burnt down. So that prompted them to dig a well on the north side of the courthouse square area, and kind of across the street from the barbershop there and the courthouse, there was a well there in later years, and that served as another place to put out or get water to put out fires.
Send buckets of water from to try to put a fire out.
Brigades, but there really wasn't any effective way to stop a fire after it started. Just trying to keep other buildings from burning also. But the 1870s brought a period of lawlessness. The outlaw element, like these frontier cities like Comanche and Brownwood and Williams Ranch, which is now in Mills County, and Jacksboro and Weatherford. That was kind of the edge of the frontier. It wasn't anything west but Comanches. And the outlaw element hid out in this area away from where they were more well known, and they began to drift into Comanche by the early 1870s. There was a gunfight where 3 men were killed in a gunfight on the Comanche at a saloon on the Comanche Square in around 1870. But we know that they're buried in the Oakwood Cemetery in Comanche in a common grave, all 3 in the same grave, and don't know who their names were or who killed them. We do know that Bill Longley, noted Texas gunfighter, was in Comanche and thought to have killed a man in a gunfight here in the early 1870s. Also, by about 1872 or 3, Joe Harden moved into Hazeldale, which is a frontier town in the east part of the county, or northeast of Gustine, and then the Hardin family kind of followed the way here, and Reverend Harden, the father of John Wesley Harden and Joe Harden, was offered a job teaching at the Masonic College here in Comanche, and the whole family moved here. So that's why John Wesley Harden started coming here. He was already on the run at that time and gaining his reputation. And he came up here with a cattle herd and left it at Hamilton in May of 1874. And he came on up with some of his buddies to Comanche to visit with his folks and his kinsmen, and he drifted down to Williams Ranch, and it was Brown County then, but in the Mills County now. Anyway, he had a run-in with a guy, Brown County Deputy Sheriff named Charlie Webb. There was a telegraph from Austin to Williams Ranch to Brownwood to Fort Concho in those days, and somebody at Williams Ranch telegraphed the Brown County Sheriff that said, "Hey, there's been a hanging down here. You need to come see about it. And oh, by the way, there's John Wesley Harden and his gang are here." So the sheriff sent Charlie Webb down to see what was going on, and Webb tried to make a play on Harden at the saloon in Williams Ranch, but Harden got the drop on him and made Webb drop his guns and ran Webb out of town, humiliating him. So Webb didn't forget that and found out that John Wesley Harden was going to celebrate his 21st birthday in Comanche the next week. So what other people didn't know was that Charlie Webb was the leader of the Brown County vigilante mob as well as being the deputy sheriff. So he brought 15 members of the mob to Comanche to help settle the score with Harden, and got in with Comanche County Deputy Sheriff Frank Wilson. And Webb said, "If you'll draw Harden out, follow him around the saloons in town." After he got through winning the horse races and things, they were celebrating and getting drunk. And Webb said, when you get to, they watched Harden and his bunch go from saloon to saloon, and then they finally wound up at Jack Rice Saloon on the northeast part of the square. And Webb said, "You go into the saloon and draw Harden out in the alley behind," and said, "I'll come around and I'll get him." And when Deputy Sheriff Wilson convinced Harden to go out in the alley, he said, "Come out, John, I need to talk to you out here in the alley." And when they got out in the alley, Harden looked up and saw Webb coming down the alley toward him. So he made his way back to the east door of the saloon, and Webb caught up with him by then. And Harden said, "Do you have any papers for my arrest?" And Webb said, "No." And Harden said, "Well, come in the saloon. I'll buy you a drink and a cigar." And Webb refused and turned his back and started walking off. So John Wesley turned his back, and Webb whirled around and shot Wes Harden in the side. And Harden immediately turned around and fired a fatal shot at Webb. And also Jim Taylor and Bud Dixon also fired into Webb, and Webb fell dead in the street just outside the east door of the Jack Rice Saloon.
Oh my gosh. That should be a movie almost. It's like suspenseful. I'm sitting here on the edge of my seat. What's about to happen? And I've heard this story before. I mean, there's got to be somebody that's never heard about this that's thinking, what a story.
Of course, about that, John Carnes was coming down the alley behind Webb because his revolver was acting up, and there was a gunsmith where the Comanche fire station is now, named J.J. Franklin. And he heard the gunshots around the corner, and then the sheriff walked up and said, who did this? And John Wesley Harden said, "I did," and broke open his Smith & Wesson and shook out the shells and handed to Carnes. But about that time, the 15 members of the Brown County mob came around the corner with their guns drawn, and John Wesley grabbed his gun back from Sheriff Carnes, and they hid out, got back in the saloon for safety. And this mob kept growing on the courthouse square. Brother Joe and Reverend Harden came across from Joe Harden's livery stable, which is where the Simmons Bank is now. And the crowd disarmed them. And finally, Joe and Wesley looked out the east door of the saloon and saw 2 horses tied to some chinaberry trees where the city hall is now. And he and James Taylor made a race for the horses and mounted the horses. And about that time, a guy named Henry Ware stepped out of the crowd and fired a shot toward Harden, and made his horse rear up, and his gun fell out on the ground. And Sheriff Carnes, being a friend of John Wesley Harden's dad, grabbed the gun because he knew the mob would lynch him if he caught him, and tried to throw it to Harden, but he missed it. And that's where the gun, Carnes kept the gun and passed it on, and it's still in the hands of a collector down in Georgetown now. But Harden made his way back to Reverend Harden's house, which is out on just a little bit on Highway 2247 north, on the north part of town. And Sheriff Carnage came riding up with Harden's dad, and Harden tried to surrender again, and Sheriff said, "No, I can't protect you now till the mob dies down. Go out and hide out a few days out on Round Mountain and then come back in and surrender." But he never got a chance to come back because there were about a 500-man posse looking for John Wesley, and they stayed up on Round Mountain for several days and finally made a break for it. And by the time he got to Austin, he found out that the Brown County mob had came over and got Brother Joe and the 2 Dixon cousins and lynched them out about 3 miles south of Comanche on the road going to Zephyr and Mullen, about where the road forks there. That's where the hanging tree was. And that hanging tree is at the Comanche County Museum now. That's what's left of it then.
Oh, really?
And
so
it kind of gives you an idea.
Well, John Wesley made it to Austin?
He made it to Austin. The posse, they rode in through a posse during a rainstorm, and he'd ride up to a posse member and point his gun at them. They'd throw their gun down. And he and James Taylor burst through the posse, but Harden had what you call a needle gun, which was a Springfield trapdoor 50-70 caliber rifle, and he would stop every so often and put the rifle over his saddle and fire at the posse. Kept them at bay long enough to where they finally gave up. And by the time he got to Austin, someone rode in and told him that his brother Joe had been lynched, so he made his way back to Comanche to see what had happened. But the whole Hardin family was under arrest, and it just got worse from there. And of course, Harden hid out for about 3 more years and was caught in Florida and brought back to Comanche for trial in 1877. But then a new courthouse had been built in 1875, and a new jail was built on North Houston to house Harden in when they brought him back for trial. But they couldn't get him on first-degree murder. They only could convict him on second-degree murder. And so they sentenced him to 25 years in prison at Huntsville. And while in prison, he became a lawyer, and the Governor Hogg pardoned him in about 1894, and he drifted out to El Paso and was assassinated by John Selman while he was in the saloon one night with his back to the door. So,
oh my gosh, what a story. Also, I was interested. So, I mean, was a saloon the best business back in the day? Because it seemed like there was a saloon on every 5 steps.
There was a Carnes and Wilson saloon, which was run by John Carnes and Frank Wilson.
And Carnes was a sheriff.
Of course, the Wyatt Earp and all his brothers, they bought saloons and ran them because none of them had made enough money as a lawman to
get by
on. And
so they built a saloon so they could have a little money to survive.
The occupation tax on the Jack Wright saloon said you paid tax on a saloon and and 2 billiard tables. There was a billiard hall in the back part of that saloon. Guy Carnes said that there was a lattice work between the saloon and the billiard hall, and that would have been back toward probably where your office used to be. And
I don't know. Tell me about that. What do you mean, my office?
Didn't you have an office
anyway, on the square?
It's where the J.W. Hardin Wine Company is going to be.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
It's in that building.
Gotcha. Yeah.
In the back of that building.
Are all those buildings on the corners of the square? Are those kind of the first ones? Like David showed me a picture a minute ago of what looks like the Starbo's building is still there. Yes. That was a bank at
Comanche National Bank, yes.
Is that who built that, or did somebody else build that?
It was built by Comanche citizens and founded that bank. They had a little bit of help from a banker in Brownwood named Henry Ford, who later on we found out had 80 different alias names. He was thought to be the notorious J. Frank Dalton. They ran with the James Younger gang, and right. He had put together this bank here. They relied on him for advice, but they may not have known who he really was. But he was a very successful Brownwood banker in his later years. But
yeah. So and now where the J.W. Hardin Wine Company's going in, what was that? So this is the opposite. This is kind of like catty corner on the square.
It was in probably the west part of that building. That's where the saloon was. It's probably just I don't know whether it was
It wasn't that building you see now, though.
No, that was built in about 1891 as for the First National Bank of Comanche.
Okay. So now we've got 2 banks, 17 saloons. I mean, it's kind of just a lot of
Comanche, fun. Even up to the Prohibition.
Was there something else going on in those saloons besides the drinking and card playing and billiard playing?
Not that anybody's ever confessed to, but it was.
It wasn't like where you'd get your groceries too or something. No,
I don't think so.
Yeah,
there were a lot of grocery stores around the square at different times, and other businesses,
dry goods and that kind of thing,
and all kinds of things. And but it was in 1875, Jesse James wrote a letter from Comanche to a Kansas City newspaper, and the James brothers had friends here in Comanche, and the friends in Brownwood. So when they would want to hide out a while here, they'd come, and they had.
I mean, you were right earlier when you said the outlaws started hanging out here because that's where they were just far enough away from anybody to bother come looking for them.
In 1876. Henry R. Martin had a bank on about where the beer garden is, or the buildings are attached to it. Anyway, it was the outlaw Joe Horner and his gang from North Texas came down, and they were being trailed by a lawman, and he stopped out on the road west of Comanche at M.O. Coker's house, and he saw Horner and his gang go by toward Comanche, so he followed them into town, and by the time he got there, he saw them getting off their horses behind the Martin Bank building, and they went in and robbed the bank and came out and took off and said, one of them yelled, "Charge this to the James boys." And this lawman, Henry W. Strong, I think was his name, he recognized Boss Green in the crowd that was gathering, and Boss Green was the city marshal of Comanche at that time, and Strong told him what he had seen, and Boss Green sent a posse with Strong to chase the outlaws, which wound up down near San Antonio, and they finally caught up with them and arrested Horner, put him in jail, and he escaped quickly. Then they caught him at Uvalde after he had robbed a stage, and they put him back in jail and sent him to Huntsville, where he promptly escaped from there and made his way up into Wyoming and became a lawman. and got involved in the Johnson County, Wyoming cattle war. And then he drifted back down in his later years to Oklahoma Territory and applied to become a deputy U.S. Marshal. And he finally got that, and he died as the Adjutant General of the state of Oklahoma. He had changed his name to Frank Kenton from Joe Horner. So he went from outlaw to lawman and helped hunt down some of the famous Oklahoma outlaws like the Doolin Gang. But he was friends with another character that hung out in Comanche a few times, named Curly Bill Brushy. John Wesley Harden had a pal with him in 1874 here. It was named Doc Brushy, who was a brother of Curly Bill. But Curly Bill became famous in Tombstone for killing Marshal Frank.
Oh, that's Curly Bill in that movie.
And he was arrested by Wyatt Earp and Virgil Earp and put in jail. But he didn't get killed like it said was in the movie. He lived to old age and came back to Paris, Texas, and became himself a lawman and became the chief of police. And he and Frank Kenton, that I had talked about earlier, were friends. So Kenton needed some more backup to apply for being a U.S. Marshal in the Oklahoma Territory. So he came across the river to Paris, Texas to visit his old friend Curly Bill Brushy, who stuck up for him and got him that U.S. Marshal's job. And so that's two outlaws that turned lawmen.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, oh my gosh, that is so crazy.
Kenton's conscience hurt him about robbing the bank in Comanche as time went on, and so he had to beg for a pardon for robbing the bank in Comanche before he could become Adjutant General of the state of Oklahoma. Anyway, when he died, they gave him his body lay and stayed in the Oklahoma Capitol building. So from his beginnings here and around Comanche to then, you could see the transition.
Yeah, that's wild. I want to say crazy, but it's not really crazy. It's just how it was. Yeah, it's just the way it all happened.
Everybody that came up with Hardin in 74 to Comanche, even cowhands that stayed in Hamilton County with the herd, they were all arrested, and most of them carried back to DeWitt County near Gonzales. And they were lynched by mobs down there, except Doc Brushy, the brother to Curly Bill Brushy. He had a friend in the mob, and it was at night when they were hanging these guys. So that guy, Brushy, was a little guy, so he pulled him up on his saddle behind him and snuck him out, and he lived to old age too. So
yeah.
So it was not good to be associated with outlaws in those days.
I don't think so. Although there wasn't a huge barrier from turning things around. Like you could have made some bad choices, and decide to go be a lawman, change your ways, and you might just be some politician or government official ultimately.
And the irony about lawmen or bad men turning to lawmen, John Selman was a deputy sheriff in Shackelford County, where Albany is, and he got in some kind of trouble up there, and he drifted out to West Texas and got arrested at Fort Davis. So they were Shackelford County lawmen where there was a mob wanting to hang Selman in Shackelford County, so they brought him to Comanche and hid him out in the Comanche jail that had been built for John Wesley Harden some years before, and he stayed here until he got safe enough to carry him back for trial in Shackelford County, which they dropped all the charges. So Harden and the man who assassinated him both spent time in the same jail here in Comanche.
That's wild. That's wild. Okay, I mean, now we've been doing this for an hour. Do you need a break, or you want a drink of water or anything?
I get a drink of water.
All right, good. I want to get to that. What is your favorite thing out at the museum?
Okay. I guess there's so many things at the museum.
Time out. First things first. What got you? You're sitting here with not a note, nothing but your memory to tell these stories. What got you interested in history, and how come do you?
My grandfather, McDaniel, was loved history, and he taught me. I was fortunate enough to live next door to him, and where I grew up out past Sydney, and he started teaching me the history of the countryside and what happened here in our area, and he started teaching me our family history. So I got interested in that. That was when I was in high school, and as time went by, I got interested, so I started volunteering at the Comanche County Museum about 1983, and I've been associated with that ever since over the years. And but he's the one I credit with giving me the spark.
That's only about 40 years you've been over there at the museum.
My grandfather was born in 1885 in Comanche County, and he went with his father and his grandfather into Oklahoma Territory looking for new land to buy. And then when he was about 5 years old, and he actually saw wild Indians trying to steal their horses. And he said his grandfather was an old Texas Ranger, and he sat up at night with his Winchester garden, making sure the Indians didn't get off with their horses. And he lived to see men land on the moon, so you can see what he saw from seeing the real Indians in Oklahoma crossing the Red River in a wagon, and
man on the moon.
To seeing a man on the moon. So
that's pretty. It's almost hard to even picture in your brain that much change over time, how things are just got so different.
As time went on, and I'm still learning. Every week you learn something different about Comanche County history or area history, and been fortunate enough to go to a lot of these places where things happened and over the years. And I guess my favorite thing at the museum you asked about a while ago, and I don't know about David, but that's probably the veterans displays and the Native American displays. We have two gentlemen that are of Comanche Indian descent. One's a full-blood Comanche that are helping us to add to our knowledge about Comanche.
Oh, really?
About the Comanche Indians. We now have a flag of the Comanche Nation at the Comanche County Museum. So, and we're forming a new Texas Heritage Trail called the Penatuka Comanche Trail, and it'll be kind of like the Texas Forest Trail and other heritage trails around Texas, and starts here at Comanche and goes all the way to Fredericksburg and then out west to Paint Rock, and about 10 counties right now, and to Menard, and it'll probably expand as time goes on. So we're going to we're working with the Comanche Nation and the National Park Service and other entities to help get this, and it'd be kind of under the umbrella of the Texas Forest Trail also. But
yeah, I'm just sitting here thinking I was just born lucky, because I go in my job and work and the things that I do, I'll introduce myself, Neil Dudley from Comanche, Texas. And people are like, well, that's a cool name. Just Comanche, Texas, sounds cowboy, sounds frontier, sounds interesting. And I've failed most of my life to really learn these things you're talking about, to know about them. So I'm really excited. I'm thankful. I'm grateful we got to have some conversation here around I mean, this is just the tip of the iceberg, really. There were so many buildings, so many businessmen and women, and the train started coming through. I mean, we've not really even got to present day. We're still in the 1800s, but there's so much activity right there around between 1850, let's say, maybe even 1900 with the outlaws and all that. So many stories.
Yeah, and then there were gangsters in the 20s that came through here. Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barra were seen here. Actually stayed out at Logan's Gap one night told the Boyington family who they were, and they said they offered to pay them for letting them stay overnight. And Mr. Boyington said, well, there's a thicket right over there across the road. You can stay in it tonight. So they did. And the next day they were seen at Creamer down here southeast of Comanche. And then Machine Gun Kelly, the famous bank robber and gangster during the 1920s, he passed through the area between May and Sydney and was on the run from robbing a bank out in West Texas. And there were all kinds of famous people. We've had inventors, we've had sports figures.
Yeah,
Belve
I was
Bean.
just sitting here thinking, Belve Bean. David told me a pretty cool story about Belve Bean. I'd like to touch on that a little bit. And then also I want to ask about L.D. Cox and the Indian. Let's tell those two stories a little bit. We might tell some more after that, but these will take a minute to really tell them. Now, David, you swore you weren't going to say anything, but you got to tell me what it was like having Belve Bean coaching you.
It was awesome.
Yeah.
It was awesome. Where I lived, he lived catty corner to us. And there was a vacant lot across the front of our house that me and my brother Jerry kept mowed and would go over there and practice ball. Belve Bean, when he was a sheriff, would come in. He wouldn't even go in the house. He'd be over there in the lot, teaching us how to throw a ball, how to hit the ball, to do this. And then he worked real hard with these, back then it was the JCs, in getting our baseball league started real good. He would come down and umpire. He would be up in the stand, and he would be doing the announcing and stuff like that. Me or my brother would do something wrong, and he'd come out and say, well, I didn't teach my little neighbor boy to do that.
Yeah, right.
But he was very instrumental in a lot of our playing ball together.
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's a little plaque donate or commemorate his involvement.
At the facilities now, there's a plaque down there talking about him playing professional baseball.
Yeah. I just think that's just one illustration, one story of people that come. Like every community really has these same things.
Yeah.
I'm super interested in Comanches because that's my home. It's where I was born, where my family lives today. I did meet L.D. Cox a time or two. And he, as well, I want to touch on LD, but you mentioned your kind of favorite piece of Fain, you said that your favorite piece of the museum was some of the military displays. Does that include the story of the Indianapolis and LD?
There's LD has his own display case there with all of his memorabilia, and we have everything from Santa Ana's route into Texas on his way to the Alamo. We have artifacts from there that have been found along that trail, and then up to the Civil War era, we have Civil War artifacts. We have a display commemorating the Buffalo soldiers who were here in Comanche County in 1873. And they were here actually several times on the trail of the Comanches, the 10th Cavalry out of Fort Griffin. And also we have Comanche had a high school graduate named George Fleming Moore, who became a U.S. Army general in the Pacific in World War II, and he was on with General Wainwright on Corregidor when they surrendered to the Japanese. George Fleming Moore was a Texas Aggie, and he held the first Aggie muster, I think, in the Pacific on Corregidor before the surrender. He spent the rest of the war in a prison camp and died in 1946 in San Francisco. That's where he's buried, but he was from here. And Comanche County had 3 bodyguards to generals, 2 Civil War generals, 1 Union, 1 Confederate, and a bodyguard to a World War II general, and that are all buried here in Comanche County. Those guys, and we had a Confederate Gold Star winner, which was the equivalent of the Medal of Honor that the U.S. had, soldiers had, that was given by to the members of the Hoods Texas Brigade, and one of them's buried here that won that honor. He's buried in Stone Cemetery near Proctor. There's just all kinds of people. There's another professional baseball player buried at Oakwood named Tex Carlton.
Yeah.
He played for the Chicago Cubs, I think, and some other teams. And we had another Comanche graduate named Bob Masters, who wound up playing for the Chicago Bears and set many records for them in the 1940s and probably early 50s. He's buried out at Shiloh Cemetery. And he has an NFL monument where his tombstone is donated by the
NFL?
National Football League. So
That'd be cool to see.
yeah, and there's just all kinds. You can't imagine how many people have had influence on American history or Texas history that came from Comanche County.
Yeah. It's awesome.
It is awesome.
We could sit here and talk about it for another 2 hours. I know we could. I've already thought of a bunch of questions, and there's things I'm sure once we get done here, we're going to think, man, I wish I'd have said that. All I hope, or what I really wish for anybody listening, is they'll go out to the museum, look around. Fain's liable to be there. You can meet Fain. Come to their fundraisers. David will be around. He sits on the board along with a bunch of other really generous people who donate their time and keep that thing alive and going well. So shout out to everybody that's involved with the museum, anybody that supports it. I can't name them all, but you know who you are, and I appreciate you more now than I did 5 years ago, 10 years ago. I just didn't realize, and I think sometimes it's maturity, it's getting a little older. You start realizing how robust and fun our history is and can be if you'll look into it a little bit. Talk to Fain for just a minute. I mean, you just know so much. So everybody, go check out the museum. Was there anything else you guys wanted to touch on that we haven't? I mean, we've just kind of explored generally where Comanche, Texas comes from. And to me, that's been a lot of fun. Anything else? David, you just tell me one time something about how important Comanche was really in trade. And
well, at one time, Comanche was the last outpost before you could get to El Paso.
There you go. So there was a lot of trade going on here before somebody took on a pretty arduous trip to get plumb out there. What about you, Fain? Anything else? You're like, man, I wish he had let me talk about this.
A story about trading out in West Texas in that time period. Captain James Cunningham sent a wagon out took a wagon out to the salt flats out near El Paso. Got a wagon load of salt to bring back. Got within about 100 yards of the house, and something spooked the mules, and they turned the wagon over in Mountain Creek and killed fish from all the way to the Brazos.
Turned over all the salt.
It was inside of the house. So
Yeah.
can
Don't you
imagine.
know that's like someday nowadays you might lose your phone for 30 minutes or something. You think that's a problem, but that's a lot of work just got
Imagine
dumped
how
over
many
and
miles they travel in that wagon and then see it all.
get
But
dumped
things
over.
like lots of things like that happen, but it makes for interesting stories.
Yes, sir. Sure does.
Oh yes, I left out probably one of the most important figures in Comanche. Lived a gentleman moved here in the 1930s named Brushy Bill Roberts, and that's believed by a lot. And I even think he was actually really Billy the Kid. He knew too much about what happened in New Mexico. He was from this area, really, and he worked for the turkey plant on South Houston, or down there in that area. In the 1930s, he used to trade at my grandfather's grocery store on west of where the Comanche Chief is now, near the old wagon yard. And my mother remembered him, and she remembers seeing him in that buckskin jacket, if you've ever seen a picture of him, and hat. Anyway, he moved back to Hamilton County for a while, and he came back here again in 1947 and lived down on East Fleming, not too far from here. And people that were around him believed it was him. And there's the evidence, even the new technology nowadays, facial recognition and all, everything's beginning to favor him over. There's nobody buried under the Billy the Kid grave in Fort Sumner. Whoever was in that grave originally was on the riverbank and got washed away. And with Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid being best of buddies for so many years, it's thought that Pat Garrett let him get away, and someone else died, and that probably wanted to get rid of, and allowed Brushy Bill to live on. But he went back to New Mexico about a few weeks or so before he died, and petitioned to the governor of New Mexico for a pardon for the killing of 21 men. And of course, the governor didn't believe him, and the governor had invited the press there, and all these cameras pointed at Brushy Bill. It caused him to have a stroke, and he came back to Hyco and died a week or two later. And he's buried down on the north part of the big cemetery out north of Hamilton on that highway toward Hyco.
Yeah.
But he lived here in Comanche.
Oh man, that Billy the Kid, he hit that saga of where is he, what happened, how all that. It's really a big story.
There were two brothers, and Kirkland brothers, that lived in Hamilton County that were friends of him. And he said one day Bill came by and picked him up and said, "We're going to New Mexico." So they lit out, came through Comanche and through Brownwood and stopped off at Trickham and picked up Josiah Scurlock, who was Doc Scurlock, was another buddy of Billy the Kid. And they said we lit out for Lincoln County. And they said we came back, but they knew they said they knew he survived.
Yeah.
Because they saw him after that, because he came back home.
Yeah.
And it's Doc Scurlock is buried in Eastland. So all these guys, they were around this country.
Yeah.
And like
it makes sense that they're around this part of the country. All the ties point that direction. What about this Masonic Lodge building on the corner of the square? Do you know anything about that building?
That's the Hope Lodge building. It was built, I've forgotten what year it was built, but there's a cornerstone, I think, there. The original Comanche Lodge was under a different lodge number. It was the one that Joe Harden belonged to, and Reverend Harden, and lot of Comanche citizens, and it disbanded in the late 1870s, and then they started up a new lodge, which was the Hope Lodge, and that building was built, the top floor being the lodge, the main lodge hall, and that's the story of that. Of course, the lodge now is on North Austin Street, but that's just one of the
buildings that got put up.
They got put up.
Fain, David, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
That's exactly, we're real close on an hour and a half talking about the history of Comanche.
Thanks for having us.
Oh, yeah, you're welcome. Thanks for coming. I mean, your time's valuable. Anybody's time listening's valuable. So I know this is good time well spent. And just come back to the cowboy perspective. You never know. We might be talking history. We might be talking business. We might be talking faith. But any of those perspectives are something that can be valuable to you if you listen to it.